Hi everyone, welcome to the Navigant Credit Union Broadcast Center. I'm GoLocal News Editor Kate Nagel. Thanks for joining us for the 3 o'clock show today. We have a full one for you. We are kicking off with former state representative, former Deputy Secretary of State, now heads up Stages of Freedom, Ray Rickman, for his big view.
Yesterday, I'm walking across the Providence River on my way home, 6:05, and I hear this little boy. He's a Japanese tourist, and his father and his mother and his sister. Sister's probably 7 or 8. He's probably 5. And they're looking down the river, and with total glee, he announces, "Gondola! Venice! It's Venice!" And the father's trying to explain, "No, it's Rhode Island, and they have one gondola." You know me. I pop in and I say, "We have more than one gondola." But the total excitement with this family. And I stand and I stare at the gondola, and it's obvious it's a new gondola person. He's being taught how to navigate this stunningly beautiful ship that we in Providence have. Tourist attraction. It's stunning. And as I'm watching this gondola, thinking, we get ourselves 5 more things like this, we'll increase the number of tourists. And this little boy will come back to Providence one day because of the gondola. And as I'm watching with some sense of pride, and I know the gondola owners, and you know, it's like really cool and fabulous, and then I see 50 plastic bottles and Coca-Cola, Pepsi cans float down the river and ruin the vista. Now, every year, about this time, I call Save the Bay, and I call the state, and I say, why don't you fix this problem? Now, normally it happens when it rains, because all of this garbage is along the river going out to Onlyville and the like. This garbage is a foot from the shoreline, and when it rains, it picks up hundreds, probably thousands of bottles. They float into the river. They float down past the War Memorial into the wider Providence River and then on into the bay. It's disgusting. I stopped my membership with, yes, Save the Bay, because they take no interest in the urban river. Now, I don't know what Save the Bay is doing. For 30 years, I praised them because they really did do a lot. And I'm sure they still do a lot. I'm not after criticism for accusing Save the Bay of not doing a lot. But I would like to know why they can't deal with our river. Now, some of it's education. We need to tell our 5-year-old children and 15-year-olds and 35-year-olds and 55-year-olds to quit throwing garbage on the into and on the edge of the river. And then it won't be there to float into the river and then down. But I believe Save the Bay could do something about this. This is my challenge. The next time, next year, when a 5-year-old kid comes all the way, halfway across the world, and sees this beautiful gondola, stunning black ship, gracefully floating. Well, it's not floating, it's being rowed. They won't see 100 nasty pieces of trash floating on the Providence River.
Hi, everyone. Welcome back to the Navigant Credit Union Broadcast Center. I'm GoLocal News editor Kate Nagel. Thanks to Ray Rickman for coming in today on Friday to give his big view. I'm excited to welcome my next guest here into the studio, Rhode Island native Spencer Sullivan. Thanks for joining us again.
Happy to be on, as always.
Okay, well, we're going to get the inside the Beltway take, lean campaign strategies. But before we go to the political season, let's just talk about the political climate in general. Really want to kick off with Trump lawyer Michael Cohen. His issues stem beyond Stormy Daniels at the moment. So let's talk a little bit about why he's at the center of the firestorm. And let's talk about AT&T's engagement of him. And is this business as usual, or is there something more to this?
I don't think anything with the Trump administration is business as usual. And I think that kind of leads to the hand of what we're talking about here is what they're saying is that AT&T paid Michael Cohen for essentially strategic insight, right? Not lobbying. So coming up doesn't look great. But again, it's one more thing that comes out. You know, I think one of the questions is how were these documents leaked, which is an important thing to talk about as well. But again, PRI is not great. The interesting part here, though, is when the FBI raided Michael Cohen's office, it was the public corruption unit that did that, right? And it's the public corruption unit that would go after something like this.
And so, how do you think Michael Cohen fares?
What else does Bob Mueller know, right? I think Bob Mueller knows a lot more than we do. And I think, only more is going to come out, and we'll see how it goes. But I mean, I can't sit here and tell you or anyone here how it's going to end up, because there's probably a lot more information out there that we don't even know about yet.
So in a little bit, we're going to be talking with Terrence Rohrig at the Naval War College here. He's an expert on the Korean Peninsula. Let's talk a little bit about Trump and his relations with North Korea, what we've seen, and what is it correlated to inside the Beltway? What's the response been to how Trump has brokered this basically peace between North and South Korea, going to meet with Kim Jong-un? What's the reaction been like?
I think it's cautiously optimistic, right? I mean, North Korea is a very tricky issue to talk about. I mean, we've been to these stages before with North Korea. Maybe not as far as this at this stage, with as many concessions or kind of the limelight that you see North Korea having right now. Obviously, the fear is, North Korea is just doing this. It's putting this good show on to be legitimate, to appear legitimate, and to gain more highlights on the world stage, right? So I think the issue comes down to, what does this meeting look like? I think there's some concern on the left that Trump will just cut a deal because he sees himself as a negotiator. But I don't think that's going to happen. I think he's willing to walk away. I think there's a lot of good stuff there to be had. And I think in Trump's favor is his unpredictability, right? We saw these with the tariffs. We saw this. A lot of these foreign policy, a lot of these countries, foreign actors don't know how to work with Trump. And obviously, unpredictability is not always the greatest thing in some aspects of foreign policy, right? But in terms of negotiations and deal making, it can't hurt.
Do we have any sense? I mean, we've heard a date, I believe June 12th in Singapore. If you're a betting man, does it happen on that day as planned?
Again, nothing is usual with this administration. I think we're going to see a great photo op. Hopefully a good come about from that meeting. Maybe some type of agreement in place, negotiations in place to continue negotiations. We've seen how long it takes NAFTA to go along with those negotiations, and the Chinese tariffs and everything else, and the Iran deal. But I think, if everything goes well, maybe we see some type of, photo op, handshake, a mutual agreement to work on, and then kind of let both countries figure it out from there.
So we've seen a lot of progress on the front with North Korea, but obviously we've seen some dismantlement with Iran. What's the talk there as to where things stand now moving forward as we see hostilities between Iran and Israel?
Yeah, I think what you're really seeing here is just a more pro-Israel U.S. administration, right? I mean, the former President Obama administration wasn't very pro-Israel. striking that Iran deal. And what you see here is Israel, of course, and obviously the United States being very concerned over the influence that Iran has peddled in the Middle East since the past couple of years or so. So what you're seeing here is obviously Israel is getting very upset, very concerned of Iran trying to place military strategic bases in Syria to attack Israel from there, right? So I think you're seeing Israel trying to obviously defend its own sovereignty from those attacks, like as it should, and then trying to really stop or reduce or even slow down the influence of Iran expanding throughout the region of the world, which is probably also due to the Iran deal and the billions of dollars of assets it's received, right, from the Iran deal in order to peddle more influence.
And concerns talk about the future, as you just talked a little bit about Iran-Israeli relations, for potential for destabilization. On one peninsula of the Korean one, we see some seeds sown to see some stability, but now there are some X factors as it pertains to the Middle East. Yeah, and I think the Middle East is it's going to stay that way. I don't think one president is going to solve it, to be honest with you. I don't think anyone really expects that. I think you got to take it deal by deal, region by region, and I think that's something where President Trump's working on, is trying to negotiate deals, work within the countries he can work with, and take it by case basis. So let's go from some foreign policy to something more domestic, your bread and butter as a consultant. With midterms coming up, how big's your roster, Spencer? Yeah, it's good. It's a lot of good stuff out there on the Senate side, the House side. A lot of good Senate races to watch. I think even we saw today or even yesterday, the generic ballots closing down very close. I think it's down to like 3 percentage points. Democrats favored. Back in February, the generic ballot was, I think, 16 percentage points in favor of the Democrats, or close to. So you're seeing a lot of the, and even I think 2 days ago, you saw a poll come out through CNN saying, 57% of the people think the country's on the right track, which is a very impressive number, which is a very strong number for the Republicans to rely on coming onto the midterms. Because as you know, the midterms are often a check and balance on the current administration. However, if you're seeing the majority of Americans saying the country's on the right track, then that's obviously going to be a little bit more difficult for Democrats to run against President Trump in certain swing districts. I think the last time in 2010, when the House switched from Democrats to Republicans, that same question was polled, right or wrong track for the country. It was like around 26, 27%. So 57% is a very impressive number. Obviously, President Trump's approval rating stays in the 40% range, which isn't ideal, but it's staying steady. And it's not like he was ever in a very high approval rating to begin with. So you talk about, is this the best position the Republicans have been in this year with those numbers that you talk about? Yeah, I would say so. But again, things change so quickly. Politically, things can change. One tweet away, one mishap away. If the North Korea thing becomes into this massive failure or something else happens, politically, everything can shift on very quickly on a dime, right? So the question is, I think there's a little momentum here in the past couple of weeks, a good amount of good news. Of course, the distractions are always there with Russia and Micah Cohen, Stormy Daniels, whatever it may be. The distractions are always going to be there, and I think the American people are getting used to that. I don't think they're a huge fan of the president, but they like some of the achievements he's been getting done, right? Tax reform, taking care of ISIS and making sure that's not a problem. Seeing the momentum with the North Korea negotiations, right? So I think there's some momentum here, but as in the past year and a half shows you anything, we often like to step on our own toes and stop the momentum. So can we, or can President Trump or the Republican Party continue that momentum for as long as possible? So what are some of the key races that we're keeping an eye on? And of course, feel free to mention some that you might have some say in. Yeah, so I think on the Senate side anyway, it's a very defensive map for the Democrats. There's a lot more Democrats up for election in which states that Trump won, right? You're looking at North Dakota, Montana, West Virginia, or even Missouri, right? I think a good outcome in the West Virginia primary you saw last week or 2 days ago, was that the more
unifying Republican candidate won in West Virginia, which is going to make life a little bit more harder for Joe Manchin. Then on the House side, it's really going to come down to the suburban districts, and can the Republican Party maintain the suburban vote, even though a lot of the suburban districts are not a huge fan of President Trump. And I think, ideally, in my own personal opinion on the House side, it's really going to come down to, how many seats can the Republican Party hang on to in Pennsylvania? That map's been completely thrown out the window, put back in. Everything's new. Orange County, I think there would be a lot of people surprised how many Republicans are elected, Republican members of Congress in California on the House side.
Okay.
Can Orange County hold 3 or 4 of those seats? And then, little bits of races in Illinois and throughout the country. But again, it comes down, can you, on both sides of the, I think I saw a poll the other day in which gas station sushi had a higher approval rating than the Republican or Democratic Party, right? So none of the parties are really likable. So as a candidate, as a Republican or a Democrat, can you appeal to the base, but also distance yourself enough to win the swing voters in the swing districts, right?
It's a fine dance. It's a fine line. I appreciate you're giving us a little bit of the insights. $1 million question, will Spencer Sullivan be back in Rhode Island this summer?
I hope so. I hope to get back up there. I think time's flying by. I got to get away at some point, get back up there, go to Block Island, see the family, get some Dell's lemonade, right? Of course, maybe catch a Red Sox game. But I'd love to. It's just a matter of if I can actually spare the time and even plan it out.
It's the busy season. It's the silly season. We are fully in campaign mode here. I appreciate picking your brain a little bit as to what to watch for the midterms and giving us a little bit of the inside scoop as to what's taking place down in D.C. Spencer Sullivan, appreciate, as always, getting your perspective here.
Thank you.
In the studio. Thanks, Spencer Sullivan. Don't go anywhere. We'll be right back with Bob Whitcomb. Hi, everyone. Welcome back to the Navigant Credit Union Broadcast Center. I'm GoLocal News Editor Kate Nagel. We'd like to thank GoLocal columnist Bob Whitcomb for coming in today. Got plenty to talk about.
Sure do.
Just heard from Spencer Sullivan in D.C. giving his take on things happening inside the Beltway. Interesting to talk about Michael Cohen and the latest that he finds himself in with. Some folks say, well, what do you think lawyers do?
No, he's a crook. His long history as a crook and a fixer. Apparently, he's not even a very good lawyer, but he's corrupt. And most of the people around him are corrupt in various ways, including the President of the United States, who, in my view, is basically a mobster. But, we were just talking, Mr. Sullivan, I think the Republicans could do fine this fall, if the economy is okay.
It's all about the economy.
Right. People, it's the line from the Clinton campaign, is the economy stupid?
Stupid, yep.
And, they could even hold on to the House. I rather doubt it, but they're giving Trump credit for the economy. In fact, he has nothing to do with it. There was a story in GoLocal about who's to be praised for Rhode Island's economy, whether Gina Raimondo or Donald Trump. My answer is neither.
C.
These are broad C, right. It's like an SAT test. There are broad things in the economy which transcend who's ever in office. And I think that governors and presidents get blamed too much and they get praised too much for the general state of the economy. The Federal Reserve Board, of course, is much more important in that. And then there are broad changes in technology, geopolitics, and so on, which affect the general economy much more than individual, macroeconomic decisions by the CEO, whether it's the state or the country. And the case of Rhode Island is particularly preposterous because the place is so tiny, densely populated, very tiny. It's part of a regional, national, international economy. And, I suppose a real lunatic governor could complete it. It's conceivable that he or she could destroy it, could derail everything. But, we're a satellite in many ways of Boston.
As pointed out by Len Ladaro and
quite right.
Today in GoLocal.
Len is absolutely correct, as usual, I might add. And so I just think it's kind of ridiculous to blame or to praise the governor for the state of the economy. I don't think she's made it worse, and I think she's done some good things that have had a marginal effect, marginally benign effect. I think some of the educational stuff. I remain a skeptic about a lot of the incentive programs to bring big companies here. I thought one of the more entertaining ones are to keep a big company here, to make them expand as electric boat.
Talking about EB.
Yeah, electric boat, okay. Rhode Island and Connecticut, which are the two main places for making these nuclear submarines, are both throwing lots of money in incentives, tax breaks and some other stuff, some paying for some infrastructure stuff, so on. They're spending a lot of money. Connecticut more than Rhode Island, but Connecticut is bigger. But as my friend Chris Pell and other people noted, we're basically paying them to do what they would do anyway. I know their money comes from the federal government. These are federal contracts, so we're kind of paying twice.
So we're paying out twice.
Yeah, it's like we're paying through our federal income taxes, and we're also paying through our state taxes. So I kind of wonder about this. Now you could say, Whitcomb, you don't know what you're talking. We can't take the risk of these people leaving. I don't think with the infrastructure, the fixed cost, fixed cost,
that they could go anywhere.
That they go anywhere. So it is kind of ridiculous, but it sounds good, in part because the jobs at Electric Boat tend to be more high-paying, much more high-paid than some of the service industry, which is the largest part of the economy. But some of them don't pay very well, too. There's been some exaggeration about how much pipe fitters get paid.
Well, there was some some chatter surrounding incentives for EB. Speaking of incentives, one of the things that GoLocal had reported on this week, Rhode Island spends a small amount, I'd say small, probably about $700,000 for the Volvo Ocean Race.
Right.
Now, we were down there on the kickoff day on Tuesday.
Was it fun?
It was fun. I mean, the money that is involved in this race.
Yeah, it's rich people. The whole Volvo race, it's all about rich people having a good time. So like the America's Cup was, especially before they went to catamarans and this kind of thing. It was basically a bunch of, it still is, rich people.
But it brings money in. It's got to bring, the amount of money that it brings in for folks coming in, the boat staying here, the whole 9 yards.
Well, I wonder if anybody's talked to the economic development people in Newport County as to how much money it brings in.
Brad Reed had given us if you look at the interview we had with him as well, the head of Sale Newport tens of millions talking about the economic impact. So they'll be there through May 20th. It was fun to check out. I mean, it's just a lot going on.
Also, I think that's probably a relatively low expenditure by the state and the city. It's not like giving tens of millions of dollars in incentives to build infrastructure and stuff like that. I mean, they're just sailing into Fort Adams, basically.
It was impressive to see. Check it out. It'll be here until May 20th. Other things going on this week, we touched upon it. You touched upon organized crime. There's a trial going on right now.
Married to the mob.
As GoLocal and others have reported the trial going on right now, the Cadillac.
I mean, this was just a trip down memory lane. It reminds me of days back, way back when I used to cover stuff in the north end of Boston, which you recall was sort of the mob center of New England. They would kind of vie for supremacy between Atwells Avenue and the north end. And I thought, oh boy, a trip down memory lane. I was also amused. I shouldn't be amused by someone being killed, but I was I've always been sort of entertained.
Where to put the body? Where you put the body?
Rhode Island. It wasn't Swan Point either.
No, it was not. No, it was not Swan Point.
No, it wasn't Swan Point. So he ends up here. It was really a Boston disagreement.
Speaking of land, one of the things that came out this week, Carpianato looking for a big development along 195.
Very interesting, kind of long, a long one.
Along that stretch there, right by the laborers building. I mean, all the attention's been a lot mostly on Fain right now, in that big tower.
The skyscraper.
But it'll be interesting to see moving forward. I mean, it looks like it would be a big development.
Yeah. It actually, from the sketch, it looked kind of attractive. But that's the sketch.
Renderings are renderings.
Who knows? Yeah, it's a rendering, and its success, its aesthetic success depends upon what it's made out of and stuff like that. It'll look rather attractive, and that's a pretty successful developer. They know how to do things.
And then we'll see what happens. The former Newport Grand.
Right. Yeah, which is hideous. I was down at the War College yesterday, the U.S. Naval War College, and I went by there. That has to be one of the ugliest structures in New England.
Well, you know, when the referendum for the turning the slots to table games was to take down the slots sign. That was
I know, it's so tacky.
That was
the
it's a little concession.
Like when the Indian tribes got involved in gambling, they almost always started with slots, and it looked like a kind of slots palace in some depressed area of upstate New York. Yeah, and I hope they tear it down and put a show place there.
We'll see what happens moving forward, but it looks like there's plans to do so. Speaking of moving forward, what are we going to expect from you this weekend?
Well, a number of things. I know it's getting boring, but I think I have to keep up the pitter-patter. Something about Michael Cohen and his activities, and this business of he's getting all this money from these companies to basically influence peddling. I don't think that's illegal, unfortunately. That's the way, that comes under the First Amendment, the right to petition. The right to petition.
The right to grease palms.
And there was as you're certainly aware, Judge Nettie Vogel had put a gag order on the press from asking jurors questions. This was fairly directly unconstitutional, but I'm sympathetic. I did say I was sympathetic. Yeah, I'm sympathetic to the judge and certainly to the jurors who don't want to be approached. Now, their approach to that can be to they don't have to answer.
You can say no comment.
But I'm sympathetic. I've been on juries, and I understand that Judge Vogel was trying to be humane for the jurors.
Well, but as we saw, did not stand up.
Yeah, and let me see what else is cooking. There's a wonderful piece in this terrific online publication called City Lab about buses. One just went by here. And we kind of undervalue buses in their flexibility and their ability to take people out of little cars that are jamming the roads. And it's filled with suggestions about technology and new bus routes and that sort of thing, which I think we should be thinking about, especially in places like Providence and Newport, densely populated, where buses could be useful. It's very old-fashioned. It's very it's not, there's sort of a class thing about it. I couldn't possibly go on a bus. I'm far too high up in society to do that. But we need them desperately. And there's another story in there about turning old retail stores, empty retail stores, big box, like closed Kmarts and this kind of thing, into schools. And the reason I thought of that kind of popped up at me is that the governor has a kind of $1 billion plan to fix all the schools. And if this Kmart that they fixed up outside of Chicago is any indication, this could be a model. It could be cheaper and better to take an empty big box store and turn it into a seriously, and turn it into a school.
There's a specific
They're
model
better
in
condition.
Chicago.
Most of the big box stores around here are newer than most of the schools.
That is true.
Some of them are very well built, and there's this wonderful example out in Chicago. It was a Catholic school where they did the whole thing all over again. They gutted it, and it's terrific.
That sounds fascinating. I look forward to reading on Sunday, on Mother's Day.
Yeah.
So thank you. Appreciate, as always, Bobby, taking the time to come in, read his column on GoLocal on Sunday, and see him back in studio in the future. Thanks, Bobby.
Very good.
Okay,
Thanks, Kate.
I'll let you go.
Bye-bye.
Don't go anywhere. We're going to be back with Terrence Rohrig at the Naval War College, expert on the Korean Peninsula, to talk about the latest. Hi, everyone. Welcome to the Navigant Credit Union Broadcast Center. I'm GoLocal News editor Kate Nagel. Thanks for joining for this 3 o'clock politics and news show. I'm excited to welcome my next guest. He has been here before, Dr. Terrence Roerig at the Naval War College, expert on the Korean Peninsula. Thank you for joining us today.
Happy to be here, Kate.
Well, there has certainly been a lot since we've spoken last, and there's a lot been taking place this week as well. But I want to probably go through maybe from a time frame standpoint as to everything that's transpired, both between North and South Korea, and now what we see looking forward with President Trump slated to meet Kim Jong-un on June 12th in Singapore. So let's talk a little bit about the lead up to this historic peace brokerage between the North and South. And let's talk specifically, a lot of chatter about the role that President Trump has played, but you really know the inside players, you know the situational awareness. How was this made possible, and how much of a role did President Trump have or not have?
Sure. Let me start with the history that you suggest is important here. South Korea had a special election in May of 2017, so just about coming up on a year now of the South Korean President Moon Jae-in in office. And he campaigned on a pro-engagement policy with the North Koreans. And he was the front runner in this election from the get-go. And so we had a good idea this is what we were going to be getting. And so when he was elected, he reached out to the North Koreans almost immediately. But the North Koreans didn't appear to be very interested. He was greeted with more missile tests, another nuclear test. And so there seemed to be very little opportunity for his pro-engagement strategy to work. And so there was a good deal of harmony between Washington and Seoul on their North Korea policy. Fast forward to New Year's Day, when the North Korean leader traditionally gives a New Year's address that outlines, it's sort of their version of a State of the Union. And Kim Jong-un said very clearly, offering an olive branch to South Korea, indicating that he might be willing to participate in the Olympic Games. And lo and behold, South Korea has their opening. They follow up. We have several meetings that follow. The North Koreans send a delegation to the Olympic Games. They march in together under a single unification flag. They host a joint women's hockey team. Several more meetings after that, and we have the announcements that there will first be a South Korean, North Korean meeting at the DMZ, then the big surprise that there would be a U.S. North Korea summit meeting. And then snuck in between all of that, the North Koreans and the Chinese decide to mend their fences and have a meeting as well. And so, my gosh, we have summits breaking out all over, and it looks like peace is going to be on the Korean Peninsula. But I would caution your viewers that they manage their expectations. While this is all good, and I am absolutely supportive of dialogue to try to reduce tensions and bring some greater degree of peace and stability to the peninsula, particularly where we were several months ago, we are a long way from getting to a denuclearized North Korea. To the second part of your question, what role did Trump play? There is some debate about this, but I think it is very plausible to argue that the sanctions and the tougher policy that the United States had towards North Korea had some degree of impact in bringing the North Koreans back to the table. But there's also an argument to be made that this has been part of Kim's strategy all along in developing his capability, getting it to this point, and he was planning to come back to the table regardless. So the short answer is we really don't know for sure. But I think it's plausible, again, to argue that these pieces had a role to play.
Is that a lot of the speculation as to really sort of the psychological motivations of Kim Jong-un and trying to question his motivations? I'm sure lots of folks are looking at him as he is, again, moving forward in the international sphere. You know, is he an honest broker? Does he have underlying motives? Is that just something that outsiders might not be able to ever figure out?
Sure, and I think that is another piece to this that there is a good deal of debate and uncertainty about. There are many who argue that past North Korean behavior would make one skeptical to believe that the North Korean regime would necessarily come to any agreement that would be acceptable for the United States and South Korea, and then the second piece to that, actually follow through on that. But on the other hand, folks argue that there is a possibility Kim Jong-un has a new view on some of these things. Perhaps he has some different goals and willingness to approach some things differently. My own personal view on that is that I am skeptical, but I think, again, that these talks are absolutely essential to explore these possibilities. We don't know if we don't sit down with the North Koreans, talk about these issues, see what they truly are willing to do, what is achievable, but certainly to go in with our eyes wide open to make sure that we negotiate as tough as they are going to and be prepared to see where this takes us, but again, with a very realistic mindset.
Let's talk a little bit about the prisoner release and the reaction and the implications in the international community.
Sure. It certainly is good news for these three individuals, for their families. To get them back home is a great news story, and the administration deserves credit for that. It also is, I think, a positive sign from North Korea that they were willing to release these prisoners, to be able to make a gesture of good faith moving into the negotiations. But it's also important to remember that these poor individuals were detained on pretty questionable circumstances. They have become political bargaining chips and shouldn't have been held in the first place. And so, take it with a grain of salt. But again, I think the alternative of North Korea holding them certainly was not a very good thing. And so, again, I think an important gesture, but one that needs to be considered in the broader context. Plus, important to remember that there are a number of South Koreans that are still being held, and Japan has never fully been able to receive an accounting of well over a dozen Japanese citizens who were abducted in the late 70s, early 80s by North Korean agents.
Okay.
And some have been returned, but Japan has never gotten a full accounting of these abductees, and that's another piece to this issue.
So let's talk about this planned meeting for June 12th in Singapore. Was that on your short list of possible places that this summit could take place?
It was on my short list, but I have to say, if I were a betting man, I'd have lost $20 on this arrangement, as my money was on the DMZ. But the story is that while Trump favored that initially, and it would have been the same venue that the North and South had their meetings at, he was cautioned that the optics of that would have been problematic. It would have looked a little bit too much like Trump was going to Kim Jong-un's turf. And so Singapore was viewed as much more of sort of a neutral ground between the United States and North Korea. North Korea also has normal relations with Singapore. They have an embassy and an ambassador there. Kim demonstrated in his meeting another surprise where he showed up in China early this week, that he was willing to fly someplace, which his father was not willing to fly and would only take trains somewhere. A train trip to Singapore would have been a long trip if he would have insisted on that. So again, when you put all that together, I think Kim was willing to be a little more flexible, because just being able to sit down with a U.S. president, the optics of that are going to be absolutely huge for Kim Jong-un. And so I gather to think that he was probably willing to be a little more flexible, and Singapore was a reasonable middle ground for the United States and North Korea. And lo and behold, that's where we're going to be.
So we've discussed this before when it was just in the preliminary possibility stage as to what a summit would look like between the president and Kim Jong-un. And one of the things that you had mentioned in previous interviews is that a lot gets hammered out, as a lot does in the political sphere, sort of at that staff level before the two come to that meeting as to those last things to really hammer out. How big are these delegations when we talk about a meeting between the president and Kim Jong-un? I mean, how many folks are going to be at the hotel?
You know, I'm not sure. It hasn't been announced yet, and not clear how many people are going to be there. So that remains to be seen. But certainly who goes is going to matter. one of the key pieces that is always raised about the United States side is we still don't have a number of key people in the appointed positions that you would have expected to have gone along with the president. For example, an ambassador in place to South Korea. We had a position of a special representative for talks to North Korea. That position has not been filled. So, there is some question about those positions, but certainly there are others who will take those spots, at least in the short term, to support Secretary of State Pompeo and the president going into these meetings. But you're right about how this could play out. Typically, an agreement that is going to no doubt be very detailed would have had a lot of lower level staff meetings and dialogue, setting up the details, working out a lot of those pieces, and then the leaders go in and sign the final document. And that has not been the case. But of course, folks could argue it hasn't worked well in that direction in the past. So why not try this to perhaps break some of the log jams that we have seen up to this point? But we shall see. Certainly, you have the elements of watching the technical evolution of this meeting, but also certainly just on a personal level. Do the leaders get along? Do they have some sort of personal connection? It certainly has been important for President Trump in past summit meetings with other leaders, but that is going to be equally important here. How do they get along? Are those kinds of personal relations going to be conducive to moving on to the more detailed technical pieces? But certainly a lot of things to hammer out and a lot of details to work out if we can even get to a final denuclearization agreement.
And so we have a date set on the calendar talking about being a betting man. Could there be circumstances, could anything derail this between here and there?
I think it's unlikely at this point. Certainly it's possible. And if you follow the evolution of this, when it was first announced that there was a possibility, I dare say if Vegas had any odds on some of this, it may have been a lot longer odds that the meeting was going to happen at all. And at a point there, I was perhaps 50-50, depending on all of this. But now it looks like it's very likely that it's going to happen. And I think one of the key pieces to this is that the United States and South Korea have insisted that denuclearization is the central element to this. Kim Jong-un has talked the talk about denuclearization, and I think understands that if that is not front and center, the goal, then this meeting probably would not happen. And so he has talked very much about denuclearization and his willingness to do this. But once they sit down and we start getting into the details, here is where the question comes in. Do they have the same understanding of what denuclearization means? And we shall see. But again, I think Kim Jong-un is going to be very flexible in making sure he says the right things about denuclearization to make sure he gets this meeting. Now, again, I am absolutely supportive of us pursuing this and seeing where this could go. But again, I remain skeptical that in the end we can get to denuclearization, but we have to keep trying. Diplomacy is much better than where we were a couple of months ago. Military options would be a disaster.
Okay, I've got to ask you the million-dollar question. President Trump has been tossed around as a potential name for a Nobel Peace Prize. Is he deserving of a Nobel Peace Prize?
Wow, that's a tough one. And I do have to remind you that I work for the government.
Are you going to recruit? Are you recusing yourself?
Well, that's just a hard question to answer. I think it's very difficult at this point to say whether that's going to be the case. Certainly, again, I think that he has done a number of things that have changed the narrative, changed the direction of where we are headed here. But there is a good deal of debate as to whether North Korea has acted in this way because of President Trump's policy, or that this has been North Korea policy all along. But we shall see.
We shall see. I appreciate your taking the time to Skype in and give us your perspective, Professor. We'll keep an eye on that meeting scheduled again for June 12th. Hopefully we'll have the ability to get you back on and parse what we have heard coming out of Singapore. Professor Terrence Verrig, I appreciate your taking the time to Skype in.
Thanks, Kate. Happy to be there again.
Have a great weekend. We'll talk soon.
Okay. You too. Bye-bye.
Okay. Want to thank Professor Terrence Roehrig at the Naval War College, Skyping in, talking about the latest with North Korea, South Korea, and the United States. And I appreciate all our viewers watching this afternoon here at the Navigant Credit Union Broadcast Center. We'll be back on Monday with Business Monday and more. But in the meantime, read GoLocalProv.com and check us out on Facebook. I'm GoLocal News Editor Kate Nagel.